Hey friends, welcome back to another trip through history's darker corners. Tonight, we're sitting down to a medieval feast where the bread might drive you insane, the water is teeming with invisible killers, and that delicious-looking meat. It's been rotting for weeks. Every bite was Russian roulette with your digestive system, and spoiler alert, the house always won. Suddenly, that gas station sushi you've been avoiding seems like fine dining, doesn't it? Before we dive into this culinary nightmare, smash that like button if you enjoy these twisted tales from the past, and subscribe for more stories that'll make you grateful for modern conveniences. And tell me in the comments, knowing what you know now, would you rather face a medieval feast or eat nothing but airline food for a month? Now, settle in somewhere comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a little, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum that helps these stories flow. Tonight's tale might make you grateful for every modern convenience in your kitchen, from your refrigerator humming quietly in the corner to that simple act of turning on a tap and trusting the water that flows out. Picture this. You're sitting down to dinner right now. You open your refrigerator and the light flicks on, illuminating shelves of fresh food kept at a perfect 38 degrees. You grab ingredients with expiration dates clearly marked, maybe some milk that's been pasteurized, bread that's been baked in a sterile facility, meat that's been inspected by government agencies. You cook on a stove with precise temperature control, wash your hands with antibacterial soap, and eat with utensils that have been sanitized in a dishwasher that reaches temperatures hot enough to kill any lingering bacteria. This entire process, from farm to table, is governed by thousands of regulations, inspected by countless officials, and protected by scientific knowledge that took centuries to develop. You probably don't think about any of this. Why would you? Food safety is invisible when it works. But strip all of that away. Remove the refrigeration, the pasteurization, the health inspectors, the understanding of bacteria, the temperature controls, the clean water, the sealed packaging, the expiration dates. Remove the very concept that invisible organisms could make you sick. What you're left with is medieval dining, where every meal was an act of faith, and that faith was often misplaced. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just sustenance. It was a daily dance with death, a game of chance where the stakes were your life, and the house always had better odds than you did. The wealthy died from poisoned wine, the poor died from mouldy bread, and everyone in between died from 1,000 different ways that food could turn against you. Tonight, we're going to walk through a typical day of medieval eating, from the moment you wake up hungry to the moment you go to bed, hoping you'll wake up at all. We'll explore the bread that could drive you insane, the water that teemed with invisible killers, the meat that glowed green in the dark, and the cooking methods that were as likely to burn down your house as they were to prepare your dinner. So take a sip of that clean, safe water beside you. Appreciate that simple act of trust, because where we're going, trust was a luxury no one could afford. And every swallow was a leap of faith into the unknown. Welcome to medieval dining, where the only thing more dangerous than going hungry was trying to satisfy that hunger. Chapter 1. The Morning Meal of Death. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1347. The good news is you're alive. The bad news is you're absolutely starving. And breakfast is about to become a life or death decision. Your stomach is gnawing at itself with a hunger that modern people rarely experience. There's no quick bowl of cereal waiting for you, no toast popping up golden brown, no fresh orange juice in the refrigerator. In fact, there's no refrigerator. There's no breakfast as you understand it at all. You stumble out of your straw mattress, which you share with your family, several chickens, and a colony of fleas that have made your body their permanent residence. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and something else, something sweet and cloying that you can't quite identify. That's the smell of grain slowly rotting in the corner, but you don't know that yet. You just know you're hungry enough to eat almost anything. And that's exactly the problem. Your first meal of the day will likely be bread if you're lucky enough to have any. But this isn't the soft, white, fluffy bread you might be imagining. This is medieval bread, and medieval bread is trying to kill you in ways you can't even comprehend. Let's start with what's actually in this bread. If you're a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly are, your bread is made from rye or barley flour. Wheat is for the wealthy, a luxury item that costs more than you make in a month. But even if you could afford wheat, you probably wouldn't want this particular loaf. Your bread has been bulked up with whatever was available and cheap. Sawdust is a popular additive, giving the loaf weight and volume without adding cost. Ground acorns, if it's been a good year for oak trees. Hay, if the harvest was particularly poor. Sometimes, if the baker is feeling especially creative, you might find ground chalk, plaster dust, or even clay mixed into your daily bread. The texture is roughly equivalent to chewing on a piece of wood, which, given the sawdust content, isn't far from the truth. Medieval bread was so hard that people joked it could deflect arrows, and they weren't entirely joking. You don't slice this bread so much as attack it with whatever sharp implement you can find, hoping to chip off a piece small enough to fit in your mouth without breaking your teeth. But the real danger isn't the sawdust or the chalk. The real danger is invisible, microscopic, and absolutely deadly. Your rye flour, the main ingredient in your breakfast, has been infected with a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. You've never heard this name, of course, because it won't be identified for another few hundred years. What you do know is that sometimes, after eating bread, people in your village start acting strangely. First comes the burning, a sensation like fire crawling under your skin, starting in your fingers and toes and spreading inward. Your extremities begin to feel like they're being consumed by flames from the inside out. This is why they call it Saint Anthony's fire, named after the saint whose monks specialized in treating the victims. Then come the visions, hallucinations so vivid and terrifying that people become convinced they're being visited by demons or angels. They see things that aren't there, hear voices that don't exist, and sometimes become so convinced of these visions that they act on them in ways that endanger themselves and others. But the burning and the visions are just the beginning. As the ergot alkaloids course through your bloodstream, they begin to constrict your blood vessels. Your fingers and toes, already burning with phantom fire, begin to turn black as the blood supply is cut off. Gangrene sets in, and if you're unlucky enough to survive the initial poisoning, you might watch your own limbs literally rot off your body. Children are especially vulnerable. Their smaller bodies can't process the toxins as effectively, and what might make an adult sick could kill a child outright. Pregnant women face the additional horror of ergot's ability to cause violent uterine contractions, leading to miscarriages or births so premature that survival is impossible. And here's the truly terrifying part. This isn't a rare occurrence. Ergot poisoning sweeps through medieval communities regularly, sometimes affecting entire villages at once. People don't understand what's causing it, so they can't prevent it. They blame it on God's wrath, on witchcraft, on bad air, on anything except the bread they eat every single day. You take a bite of your morning bread, and it tastes slightly sweet, almost pleasant. That sweetness is the ergot, and it might be the last thing you ever taste. But let's say you're lucky. Let's say your bread is only contaminated with the usual suspects: mold, insect eggs, mouse droppings, and the occasional dead weevil. You chew through the sawdust and chalk, Ignore the bitter taste of spoiled grain and wash it down with whatever liquid you can find. If you have any bread left over, you might dip it into your other breakfast staple, pottage. This is a thick, gloopy stew that's been simmering in the same pot for days, possibly weeks. New ingredients are added on top of the old ones, creating a kind of perpetual stew that never quite gets finished and never quite gets cleaned. Today's pottage might contain some barley, a few root vegetables if you're fortunate, maybe some beans that have been soaking so long they've started to ferment. The pot itself hasn't been properly cleaned in months. There's no soap, no hot running water, no understanding that the crusty build-up around the edges might be harbouring the very bacteria that could kill you. You stir the pottage with a wooden spoon that's been used for everything from stirring food to scraping mud off boots. The surface of the stew has a thin film on it that could be fat from some long-forgotten piece of meat, or it could be something else entirely. You don't investigate too closely because you're hungry, and this is what you have. As you eat, you notice small dark specks in the pottage. These could be spices, though spices are expensive and you probably can't afford them. More likely, they're mouse droppings, bits of charcoal from the fire, or the remains of insects that fell into the pot during the night. You eat around them when you can, but mostly you just swallow and hope for the best. The pottage tastes sour, slightly fermented, with an underlying flavour that might charitably be called earthy, but more accurately described as the taste of decay. This is what happens when food sits at room temperature for days without refrigeration, slowly breaking down and developing flavours that would make a modern person immediately reach for the nearest trash can. But you're not a modern person. You're a medieval peasant, and this is breakfast. You eat it because you have to, because the alternative is starvation, and because you don't know that the cramping in your stomach and the loose bowels that follow aren't just normal parts of life, but signs that your food is slowly poisoning you. As you finish your morning meal, you feel that familiar burning in your gut, the one that comes after eating but never quite goes away. You attribute it to hunger, to hard work, to God's will. You don't know that you've just consumed enough bacteria to fell a horse, enough mold spores to cloud your lungs, and possibly enough ergot alkaloids to send you into convulsions before the day is through. You wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, the same hand you used to handle the chamber pot this morning, and prepare to face the day. Your breakfast is finished, and you're still alive, for now. But the day is young, and you haven't had anything to drink yet. And in medieval times, what you drank was often more dangerous than what you ate. Chapter 2. The liquid gamble. So you've survived breakfast, and now you're thirsty. In the modern world, this would be the simplest problem to solve. You'd walk to a sink, turn a handle, and clean, safe, government-regulated water would flow out. You might even complain if it doesn't taste quite right. In medieval times, being thirsty is like playing Russian roulette, except most of the chambers are loaded. Let's start with water, the most basic human need after air. You need it to survive, but in the Middle Ages, water is actively trying to kill you. The local stream, the one that looks so clear and inviting as it babbles past your village, is actually a flowing highway of death. Upstream from where you're standing, your neighbours have been dumping their chamber pots directly into the water. Not just the contents, mind you, but sometimes the entire pot when it gets too disgusting to clean. Human waste flows downstream in a steady, invisible current, carrying with it a microscopic army of bacteria, parasites and viruses that medieval medicine has no names for and no defences against. But it's not just human waste. The village tanner dumps his chemical-laden water into the stream after treating hides. The blacksmith rinses his tools in the same water, adding metal particles and coal dust. Dead animals that couldn't be buried properly end up in the water, slowly decomposing and releasing their own special cocktail of pathogens. The water looks clear because medieval people don't understand that the most dangerous things are often invisible. They judge water quality by taste, smell, and appearance, which is roughly equivalent to judging a book by its cover if the book is trying to murder you. Even the village well, which should theoretically be safer than the stream, is often contaminated. Wells are dug by hand, usually in the most convenient location rather than the safest one. That convenient location is often downhill from the village latrine, allowing sewage to seep through the soil and contaminate the groundwater. The well cover, if there is one, is made of wood and doesn't seal properly, allowing rain to wash surface contaminants directly into the water supply. You lower your bucket into the well, and it comes up filled with water that looks perfectly fine. What you can't see are the microscopic parasites swimming in it. Giardia, which will give you diarrhea so severe you might die from dehydration. Cryptosporidium, which causes cramping and fever that can last for weeks. Cholera, which can kill you in a matter of hours through violent purging from both ends of your digestive system. These aren't rare occurrences, they're everyday realities. Medieval people suffer from chronic digestive issues not because they have weak constitutions, but because they're constantly ingesting pathogens that their bodies are fighting off. The lucky ones develop some immunity through constant exposure. The unlucky ones die. So what's a thirsty medieval person to do? The answer is alcohol, specifically beer. Everyone in medieval Europe drinks beer. Everyone. Men, women, children, babies, priests, nobles, peasants. Beer isn't a recreational beverage. It's a survival strategy. The brewing process involves boiling water, which kills most of the harmful bacteria. The alcohol content, even in weak beer, creates an environment hostile to many pathogens. Beer isn't safe, but it's safer than water, which is a terrifying commentary on the state of medieval water supplies. But don't imagine that medieval beer is like the crisp, clean lagers you might enjoy today. Medieval beer is a murky, chunky, often sour liquid that bears only a passing resemblance to modern beer. It's brewed in conditions that would horrify a modern health inspector, using equipment that's never properly cleaned and ingredients that are often contaminated before they even reach the brewery. The brewing process starts with grain, the same grain that might be infected with ergot or contaminated with mouse droppings. This grain is malted in conditions that are perfect for bacterial growth. The water used for brewing, while boiled, still starts out contaminated, and boiling doesn't remove chemical contaminants or heavy metals. The fermentation happens in wooden barrels that are reused over and over again without proper cleaning. These barrels develop a buildup of bacteria, wild yeasts, and other microorganisms that can turn the brewing process into a biological experiment with unpredictable results. Sometimes you get beer. Sometimes you get something that's closer to vinegar. Sometimes you get something that glows faintly in the dark. Children drink what's called small beer, which has a lower alcohol content but is still alcoholic. Imagine giving your 5-year-old a beer with breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day of their life. Medieval children grow up in a constant state of mild intoxication, which probably helps explain why they don't complain more about their living conditions. But even beer can kill you. Alcohol poisoning is a real risk, especially for children whose small bodies can't process alcohol as effectively as adults. The brewing process can also go wrong in spectacular ways, producing methanol instead of ethanol, which causes blindness and death. Sometimes the grain used for brewing is so contaminated with ergot that the resulting beer becomes a liquid delivery system for St. Anthony's fire. If you're wealthy enough to afford wine, you face a different set of dangers. Wine is often stored and served in vessels glazed with lead, which slowly leaches into the liquid. Lead poisoning causes a range of symptoms from stomach pain and constipation to brain damage and death. The Romans knew about lead poisoning, but somehow this knowledge got lost during the medieval period, and people went back to poisoning themselves with their own drinking vessels. Wine can also be deliberately contaminated. Adding lead compounds to wine makes it taste sweeter, so unscrupulous merchants sometimes add lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, to make cheap wine more palatable. This practice is so common that chronic lead poisoning becomes an occupational hazard of being wealthy enough to drink wine regularly. The winemaking process itself is fraught with dangers. Grapes are crushed by foot in vats that are rarely cleaned properly. The fermentation happens in conditions that are perfect for the growth of harmful bacteria. The wine is stored in barrels that might have previously held anything from olive oil to human waste, and these barrels are rarely cleaned between uses. If you're desperate enough to drink milk, you're taking your life in your hands. There's no pasteurization, no refrigeration, and no understanding of the bacteria that thrive in warm milk. Milk spoils within hours of being collected, developing a sour taste and a chunky texture that would make a modern person immediately pour it down the drain. But medieval people don't have the luxury of pouring anything down the drain. They drink the sour, chunky milk because it's what they have. And they don't understand that the stomach cramps and diarrhea that follow aren't just normal parts of life, but signs of food poisoning. The cows that produce this milk aren't exactly healthy specimens either. They're often malnourished, diseased, and living in conditions that would make a modern dairy farmer weep. Their milk reflects their poor health, carrying diseases that can transfer directly to humans. Some people try to make their water safer by adding herbs or other substances to it. Unfortunately, medieval knowledge of which plants are helpful and which are harmful is spotty at best. People sometimes add plants that are actually toxic, thinking they're purifying the water when they're actually poisoning it further. Others try to improve their water by letting it sit in the sun, thinking that sunlight will purify it. What actually happens is that the warm, stagnant water becomes an even better breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. As you finish your morning drink, whether it's contaminated water, sour beer, lead-tainted wine, or spoiled milk, you feel that familiar burning in your throat and stomach. You attribute it to the strength of the drink, not knowing that you've just introduced a fresh batch of pathogens into your system. Your thirst is quenched for now, but your body is already beginning to process the toxins you've just consumed, and your immune system is gearing up for another battle it might not win. The morning is still young, and you haven't even thought about lunch yet. But in medieval times, the next meal is always just another opportunity for death to come calling, and death is a very persistent caller indeed. Chapter 3. The Meat Market Massacre. The sun is climbing higher now, and your stomach is starting to rumble again. That breakfast of sawdust bread and fermented pottage wasn't exactly filling, and you're beginning to think about something more substantial, something with protein, something like meat. This is where things get really interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely horrifying. In the modern world, meat comes wrapped in plastic, stamped with inspection dates, and kept at carefully controlled temperatures from slaughter to sale. The entire process is monitored by government agencies, regulated by health departments, and backed by scientific understanding of bacterial growth and food safety. In medieval times, meat comes from whatever animal died recently enough that it hasn't started glowing in the dark yet. And sometimes even that standard is negotiable. Let's start with the best case scenario, fresh meat. You're lucky enough to be present when an animal is slaughtered and you get a piece of it before it has time to spoil. This sounds ideal, but even fresh meat in medieval times is a gamble with death. The slaughter process happens wherever it's convenient, which is usually not a sterile environment. Animals are killed in farmyards, in the middle of villages, sometimes even inside homes. There are no health inspectors, no sanitary requirements, no understanding that the knife used to gut the pig should probably be cleaned before it's used to cut the meat into portions. The person doing the slaughtering might be a professional butcher, or they might just be whoever happened to be available when the animal needed to die. Their hands are unwashed, their tools are unsterilized, and their understanding of cross-contamination is non-existent. They use the same knife to cut through diseased organs and healthy meat, spreading bacteria and parasites throughout the carcass. The animal itself might not have been healthy to begin with. Medieval livestock live in conditions that would make a modern veterinarian reach for the nearest bottle of whiskey. They're malnourished, diseased, and often suffering from parasitic infections that make their meat unsafe for human consumption. But you don't know any of this. You see fresh meat, and fresh meat is a luxury you can't afford to pass up. You take your portion and prepare to cook it, not knowing that it's already teeming with bacteria that are multiplying by the minute in the warm air. Now, let's talk about what happens to meat that isn't consumed immediately, which is most of it. Without refrigeration, meat begins to spoil the moment the animal dies. In warm weather, this process accelerates dramatically. Within hours, bacteria begin breaking down the proteins, producing toxins that can cause severe illness or death. The medieval solution to this problem is preservation, and medieval preservation methods are almost as dangerous as eating spoiled meat. The most common method is salting, which involves covering the meat in salt to draw out moisture and create an environment hostile to bacterial growth. In theory, this works. In practice, it's a disaster waiting to happen. First, salt is expensive. Really expensive. So expensive that it's sometimes used as currency. This means that most people can't afford to use enough salt to properly preserve their meat. They use just enough to make themselves feel better about eating it, but not enough to actually prevent spoilage. Second, the salt itself is often contaminated. Medieval salt comes from whatever source is available, whether that's seawater, salt mines, or salt marshes. It's not purified, not processed, and often contains impurities that can be toxic in their own right. Third, the salting process requires knowledge and skill that most people don't have. You need to know how much salt to use, how to apply it evenly, how long to let it cure, and how to store it properly. Get any of these steps wrong, and you end up with meat that's both salty and spoiled, which is somehow worse than just spoiled. The result is meat that's been partially preserved, which means it's safe enough to eat without immediate death, but dangerous enough to cause chronic health problems. This partially preserved meat has a distinctive taste that medieval people learned to associate with protein. It's salty, tough, and has an underlying flavour of decay that never quite goes away. Smoking is another preservation method, and it's just as problematic as salting. The smoking process requires maintaining a fire at just the right temperature for just the right amount of time. Too hot, and you cook the outside while leaving the inside raw. Too cool, and you create perfect conditions for bacterial growth. Too long, and you end up with something that has the texture and flavour of charcoal. Too short, and you might as well not have bothered. The wood used for smoking is whatever happens to be available, which might include wood that's been treated with chemicals, wood that's rotting, or wood from trees that are naturally toxic. The smoke itself can contain compounds that are carcinogenic, but medieval people don't know this. They just know that smoked meat lasts longer than fresh meat, so they assume it's safer. The smoking process also attracts flies, which lay eggs in the meat while it's being smoked. These eggs hatch into maggots, which burrow into the meat and continue to live there even after the smoking is complete. Medieval people learn to cut around the maggoty parts, but they don't always succeed in removing all of them. If you're wealthy enough to afford meat regularly, you face a different set of problems. Rich people don't just eat any old spoiled meat, they eat the finest spoiled meat available. Their meat might be imported from distant lands, which means it's been travelling for weeks or months without refrigeration. By the time it reaches their table, it's achieved levels of decay that would impress a forensic scientist. But wealthy people have spices, and spices can mask the taste of spoiled meat. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic spices are worth their weight in gold, literally, and they're used not just for flavour, but to cover up the taste of meat that's gone bad. The more expensive the spice, the more rotten the meat it can disguise. This creates a perverse incentive where the wealthy actually eat more spoiled meat than the poor because they can afford to make it palatable. A poor person will smell rotten meat and know it's dangerous. A rich person will smell the same rotten meat covered in expensive spices and think it's a delicacy. Fish presents its own special set of challenges. Fish spoils even faster than meat, and medieval people live in a world where fresh fish is available only if you live near water and catch it yourself. Everyone else gets fish that's been salted, dried, or pickled, and these preservation methods are even less reliable than the ones used for meat. Salted fish is often undersalted to save money, which means it's partially preserved and partially spoiled. Dried fish is often dried in conditions that allow flies to lay eggs in it, creating protein-rich maggot farms. Pickled fish is pickled in solutions that might contain anything from vinegar to urine, depending on what's available and what the person doing the pickling thinks might work. The fish itself might have come from polluted waters. Medieval rivers and streams are open sewers, and fish that live in these waters absorb toxins and bacteria that make them dangerous to eat even when they're fresh. But medieval people don't understand this connection. They see fish swimming in water and they assume the fish are clean. Even when meat and fish are properly preserved, they're often stored in conditions that undo all the preservation work. Salted meat is stored in damp cellars where the salt dissolves and washes away. Smoked meat is stored in areas where rodents can get to it, contaminating it with their droppings and urine. Dried fish is stored in humid conditions where it rehydrates and begins to spoil all over again. The cooking process, which should make meat safer, often makes it more dangerous. Medieval people cook over open fires with no temperature control, which means meat is often cooked unevenly. The outside might be charred while the inside remains raw, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth. The cooking vessels themselves are sources of contamination. Pots and pans are rarely cleaned properly, and they're often made of materials that can leach toxins into food. Lead glazes on pottery can poison the food being cooked in them. Copper pots can cause copper poisoning if they're not properly maintained. Iron pots can rust, adding iron particles to food that can cause digestive problems. As you sit down to your midday meal of partially spoiled, inadequately preserved, improperly cooked meat, you notice that it has an unusual colour. Fresh meat should be red or pink, but this meat has a greenish tinge that suggests bacterial growth. You cut away the obviously bad parts and eat the rest, not knowing that bacteria don't stay in neat, visible colonies, but spread throughout the meat in invisible networks. The meat tastes strange, with a flavour that's part salt, part smoke, part spice, and part something else that you can't quite identify. That something else is decay the taste of proteins breaking down and bacteria multiplying, but you're hungry and this is what you have, so you eat it and hope for the best. Within hours, you start to feel the effects. Your stomach cramps, your bowels loosen, and you develop a fever that makes you shiver despite the warm day. You attribute this to hard work, to the weather, to God's will. You don't know that you've just given yourself food poisoning, and you don't know that food poisoning can kill you. But you're still alive, for now, and there are still more meals to come, more opportunities for your food to betray you. Because in medieval times, the day is far from over, and neither is your dance with death. Chapter 4. The Cooking Catastrophe. So you've managed to acquire some questionable meat and even more questionable vegetables, and now comes the moment of truth, cooking them. In the modern world, this would involve turning a dial, pressing a button, or at worst, lighting a gas burner with a reliable ignition system. The temperature is controlled, the heat is contained, and the whole process is designed with safety in mind. In medieval times, cooking is less about preparing food and more about engaging in controlled warfare with the elements, where the elements have a significant advantage and you're armed with nothing but hope and a wooden spoon. Every medieval meal begins with fire, and fire in the Middle Ages is not your friend. It's a wild, unpredictable force that's as likely to burn down your house as it is to cook your dinner. There are no gas lines, no electric burners, no safety shut-offs. There's just wood, tinder, and the constant gnawing fear that today might be the day your cooking fire decides to consume everything you own. Starting a fire is an art form that requires skill, patience, and a fair amount of luck. You begin with tinder, which might be dry grass, shredded bark, or cloth that's been charred in a previous fire. This tinder needs to be absolutely dry, which is challenging in a climate where humidity is high and waterproof storage doesn't exist. Next, you need kindling, small pieces of wood that will catch fire from the tinder and burn long enough to ignite larger pieces. This kindling also needs to be dry, and it needs to be the right size. Too small, and it burns too quickly to ignite the larger wood. Too large, and it won't catch fire from the tinder. Finally, you need fuel wood, larger pieces that will sustain the fire long enough to cook your meal. This wood needs to be seasoned, which means it's been dried for at least a year after being cut. Green wood doesn't burn well, produces too much smoke, and can go out unexpectedly, leaving you with half-cooked food and no way to finish cooking it. But here's the problem. Good, dry, seasoned wood is expensive and hard to come by. Most people use whatever wood they can find, which is often green, wet, or partially rotted. This wood produces fires that are smoky, unpredictable, and prone to going out at the worst possible moments. The fire starting process itself is dangerous. You're working with flint and steel, striking sparks into tinder that's designed to catch fire easily. These sparks can land on your clothes, your hair, or other flammable materials nearby. Medieval clothing is made of natural fibers that burn readily, and there's no such thing as flame-retardant fabric. Once you get the fire started, you have to maintain it, and maintaining a medieval cooking fire is a full-time job. The fire needs constant attention, constant feeding, and constant adjustment. Too much wood, and the fire gets too hot, burning your food on the outside while leaving it raw on the inside. Too little wood, and the fire dies down, leaving you with lukewarm food that's perfect for bacterial growth. The cooking area itself is a death trap waiting to happen. There's no ventilation system, no exhaust fan, no way to remove the smoke and heat that build up during cooking. The smoke contains carbon monoxide, which can cause headaches, dizziness, and death if you're exposed to enough of it. But you don't know about carbon monoxide poisoning, so you just assume that feeling lightheaded while cooking is normal. The The cooking vessels are another source of danger. Pots and pans are made of materials that can leach toxins into your food. Lead glazes on pottery can cause lead poisoning. Copper vessels can cause copper poisoning if they're not properly maintained. Even iron pots can be dangerous if they rust, adding iron particles to your food that can cause digestive problems. These cooking vessels are also rarely cleaned properly. There's no soap, no hot running water, no understanding that the crusty buildup on the inside of pots might be harbouring dangerous bacteria. Pots are cleaned by scraping out the obvious food residue and maybe rinsing them with cold water. The result is cookware that's contaminated with bacteria from previous meals, ready to contaminate whatever you cook next. The cooking process itself is fraught with dangers. You're working over an open fire with no protective equipment, no safety gear, no first aid kit nearby. Your clothes are loose and flowing, perfect for catching fire. Your hair is uncovered and can easily ignite if you lean too close to the flames. Burns are incredibly common in medieval kitchens. Hot oil splatters, boiling water spills, and people accidentally touch hot metal with their bare hands. These burns often become infected because there's no understanding of sterile wound care. A simple cooking burn can lead to sepsis and death. The food you're cooking is also dangerous in ways you don't understand. You're cooking over an open fire with no temperature control, which means it's almost impossible to cook food evenly. The outside might be charred while the inside remains raw, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth. You have no way to measure the internal temperature of meat, no understanding that certain temperatures are required to kill harmful bacteria. You cook meat until it looks done, which might mean it's safe to eat, or it might mean you've just created a perfectly cooked exterior wrapped around a core of raw, bacteria-laden protein. The cooking fire produces smoke that contains more than just carbon monoxide. Depending on what kind of wood you're burning, the smoke might contain toxic compounds that can cause respiratory problems, eye irritation, and other health issues. If you're burning wood that's been treated with chemicals, painted, or taken from certain types of trees, the smoke can be actively poisonous. The heat from the fire is intense and uncontrolled. There's no way to adjust the temperature precisely, no way to create different heat zones for different types of cooking. Everything is cooked over the same fire at the same temperature, whether it's appropriate for that particular food or not. Cooking times are guesswork. There are no timers, no clocks, no reliable way to measure how long something has been cooking. You judge doneness by appearance, smell, and intuition, which means you're constantly either undercooking or overcooking your food. The cooking area is also shared with animals, children, and other family members, all of whom can contaminate your food in various ways. Children run through the cooking area with dirty hands, animals wander through looking for scraps, and adults handle food with the same hands they use for everything else. Storage of cooked food is another nightmare. There's no refrigeration, no way to keep cooked food at safe temperatures. Food that's cooked in the morning might sit at room temperature all day before being eaten, giving bacteria plenty of time to multiply to dangerous levels. The cooking fire itself can be a source of contamination. Ash and soot from the fire can fall into your food, adding gritty particles that can damage your teeth and digestive system. The fire might also be burning materials that produce toxic ash, which then contaminates whatever you're cooking. As you stand over your cooking fire, stirring your pot of questionable stew with a wooden spoon that's been used for everything from cooking to cleaning, you feel the heat on your face and the smoke in your eyes. Your clothes are singed from getting too close to the flames. Your hands are burned from handling hot metal without protection, and your lungs are filled with smoke that makes you cough. The food you're cooking smells strange, a combination of smoke, burning wood, and something else that might be the food itself, or might be something that fell into the pot when you weren't looking. You taste it with the same spoon you've been stirring with, the same spoon that's been in and out of your mouth and back into the communal pot, spreading whatever bacteria might be living in your saliva. The stew is hot on the outside and lukewarm in the middle, with a layer of ash floating on top and mysterious chunks that might be vegetables or might be something else entirely. But it's cooked, more or less, and you're hungry, so you serve it up and hope for the best. As you eat your fire-cooked meal, you feel the familiar burning in your throat and stomach. You attribute it to the spices, not knowing that you've just consumed a cocktail of bacteria, toxins and carcinogens that would horrify a modern food safety inspector. But you're still alive, and the meal is finished. Now comes the next challenge. Storing whatever food is left over, because in medieval times, throwing away food is not an option, no matter how dangerous that food might have become. Chapter 5: Storage Nightmares. You've survived breakfast, navigated the liquid minefield of medieval beverages, wrestled with spoiled meat, and emerged victorious from your battle with the cooking fire. Now comes a challenge that might be even more dangerous than all of those combined: storing your food for later. In the modern world, food storage is so simple it's almost boring. You put leftovers in the refrigerator, where they stay at a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit, protected from bacteria, insects, and contamination. You might freeze things for long-term storage, keeping them at temperatures so low that bacterial growth essentially stops. You have airtight containers, vacuum sealing, preservatives that are tested and regulated, and expiration dates that tell you exactly when something becomes unsafe to eat. In medieval times, food storage is like playing a game where the rules keep changing. The other players are all trying to kill you, and the prize for losing is death. Let's start with your medieval pantry, which is probably a generous term for what amounts to a dark corner of your single-room house where you keep whatever food you can't eat immediately. This space is damp because your roof leaks, cold because there's no insulation, and shared with every rodent, insect, and microorganism in the immediate vicinity. Your grain, which represents the bulk of your food supply, is stored in sacks made of rough cloth that's about as effective at keeping pests out as a screen door is at keeping out rain. These sacks sit directly on the dirt floor, where they absorb moisture from the ground and provide easy access for rats, mice, and insects that view your grain supply as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The grain itself is already contaminated before you even store it. It was harvested by hand, threshed on the ground, and winnowed in the open air, picking up dirt, animal droppings, dead insects, and whatever else happened to be blowing around on harvest day. It was then transported in carts that had previously carried everything from manure to dead animals, adding new layers of contamination along the way. Once it's in your pantry, the grain becomes a breeding ground for insects. Weevils lay their eggs in the grain kernels, and their larvae eat the grain from the inside out. You learn to sift your grain before using it, picking out the obvious insects and their larvae, but you can't see the eggs, and you can't remove all the insect waste that's mixed in with the grain. Mice and rats are constant visitors to your grain supply. They don't just eat the grain, they urinate and defecate in it, contaminating far more than they consume. Their droppings carry diseases that can be transmitted to humans, and their urine creates an ammonia smell that permeates everything in the storage area. But the real horror of grain storage is mold. In the damp, poorly ventilated conditions of a medieval pantry, mold grows on everything. Some of this mold is relatively harmless, just making your food taste musty and unpleasant, but some of it is deadly. Aflatoxins produced by certain types of mold are among the most potent carcinogens known to science. They cause liver damage, immune system suppression, and cancer. Medieval people have no way to detect these toxins, no understanding of their dangers, and no choice but to eat mouldy grain when that's all they have. The storage containers themselves are sources of contamination. Wooden barrels and boxes are porous, allowing moisture and pests to get in and out. They're also impossible to clean properly, so they accumulate layers of mold, bacteria, and insect waste that contaminate whatever is stored in them next. Root vegetables, which should theoretically last longer than grain, present their own storage challenges. They're kept in root cellars, which are essentially holes in the ground covered with wood and dirt. These cellars are supposed to provide cool, stable temperatures for long-term storage, but they often flood during heavy rains, turning your stored vegetables into a soggy, rotting mess. Even when the root cellar doesn't flood, it's still a perfect environment for bacterial growth. The vegetables are stored in direct contact with dirt, which contains countless microorganisms. They're packed together tightly, so when one vegetable starts to rot, the bacteria spread quickly to the others. You learn to check your stored vegetables regularly, removing the ones that are obviously spoiled and eating the ones that are only partially rotten. But bacteria don't stay in neat, visible colonies. They spread throughout the vegetable in invisible networks, so even the parts that look healthy might be contaminated. The seasonal cycle of food storage creates its own special horrors. In the fall, you harvest and store as much food as possible, knowing that you'll need to survive on these stores through the winter and into the spring. But by late winter, your stored food is running low, and what's left is often spoiled, mouldy, or infested with insects. This creates what historians call the hunger gap, the period between when your stored food runs out and when new food becomes available. During this time, people eat things that they would never consider food under normal circumstances. Tree bark, grass, leather, anything that might provide some nutrition and help them survive until the next harvest. But even during this desperate time, the food you're eating can kill you. Tree bark can contain toxins that cause digestive problems. Grass can carry parasites that infect your intestinal tract. Leather that's been treated with chemicals can poison you slowly over time. The hunger gap is also when people are most likely to eat food that's obviously spoiled. When you're starving, mouldy bread starts to look appetizing. Rotten vegetables become a feast. Meat that's green with decay becomes a source of precious protein. Your immune system, already weakened by months of poor nutrition, is least able to fight off the bacteria and toxins in spoiled food. This is when food poisoning is most likely to be fatal, when your body simply doesn't have the resources to fight off the infection. Even when you have food to store, the storage process itself can make it dangerous. Salting meat requires precise amounts of salt applied evenly and stored in the right conditions. Too little salt and the meat spoils. Too much salt and it becomes inedible. Store it in a damp place and the salt dissolves away, leaving you with spoiled meat that tastes like the ocean. Smoking food requires maintaining the right temperature and humidity for the right amount of time. Too hot and you cook the food instead of preserving it. Too cool and you create perfect conditions for bacterial growth. Too humid and mold grows on the surface. Too dry and the food becomes so hard it's inedible. Drying food seems simple, but it's actually one of the most difficult preservation methods to get right. The food needs to be dried quickly enough to prevent bacterial growth, but slowly enough to preserve its nutritional value. It needs to be protected from insects while it's drying, but exposed to enough air circulation to actually dry. The drying process often takes place outdoors, where the food is exposed to dust, insects, bird droppings, and whatever else happens to be in the air. Flies lay eggs in the drying food, creating protein-rich maggot farms. Birds and rodents steal pieces of the food, contaminating the rest with their saliva and droppings. Even when food is successfully preserved and stored, it can still become dangerous over time. Preserved meat can develop botulism, a toxin so deadly that a tiny amount can kill an adult. Stored grain can develop ergot, turning your bread into a hallucinogenic poison. Dried vegetables can become contaminated with bacteria that multiply slowly over months, creating toxins that build up to dangerous levels. The storage containers themselves can become sources of contamination over time. Wooden barrels develop cracks that harbour bacteria. Clay pots develop chips that create hiding places for insects. Metal containers rust, adding iron particles to your food that can cause digestive problems. As you survey your medieval pantry in the dim light of a tallow candle, you see sacks of grain that rustle with the movement of insects, barrels of preserved meat that smell faintly of decay, and baskets of root vegetables that are soft to the touch and covered with a fine layer of mold. This is your food supply, your insurance against starvation, your hope for survival through the long winter months. But it's also a collection of biological weapons, each item a potential source of illness or death. You reach into a sack of grain and pull out a handful, picking out the obvious insects and their larvae. The grain smells musty and feels slightly damp, but it's what you have, so you'll use it to make tomorrow's bread. You don't know that the mold growing on this grain is producing toxins that will slowly damage your liver and suppress your immune system. You check a barrel of preserved meat, lifting the lid to reveal a surface covered with a white, fuzzy growth that might be beneficial mold or might be something deadly. You scrape off the surface growth and cut into the meat underneath, which looks acceptable if you don't examine it too closely. This is medieval food storage, a constant battle against time, bacteria, insects, and the elements, where victory means you get to eat food that's only slightly poisonous, and defeat means you starve. Either way, you're probably going to die, but at least with food storage, you get to choose your method of death. And speaking of choices, it's time to talk about how your social class affects your relationship with dangerous food, because in medieval times, even death comes with a hierarchy. Chapter 6. The Social Hierarchy of Death. In medieval society, everything has a hierarchy, from the clothes you wear to the church pew you sit in. Death, it turns out, is no exception. The way your food tries to kill you depends largely on your position in the social order, creating a fascinating taxonomy of food-related mortality that spans from peasant to king. Let's start at the bottom of the social ladder, where most people live, and where food-related death is a daily reality that's as common as sunrise and considerably less welcome. If you're a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly are, your relationship with food is defined by scarcity, contamination, and desperation. You eat what you can get when you can get it, and you don't have the luxury of being picky about quality, freshness, or safety. Your daily bread is made from the cheapest grain available, bulked up with whatever fillers can be found. Sawdust, ground acorns, hay, and sometimes substances that aren't technically food at all. You know this bread isn't good for you, but it's what you can afford, and the alternative is starvation. Your meat, when you can get it, comes from animals that died of disease, old age, or accidents. Healthy animals are too valuable to slaughter for food. They're needed for work, breeding, or sale to wealthier customers. You get the sick cow, the lame pig, the chicken that stopped laying eggs. This meat is often already contaminated with whatever killed the animal, but you cook it anyway because protein is protein. Your vegetables come from whatever you can grow in the small plot of land you're allowed to use, often the worst land available, the land that floods in spring and bakes hard as stone in summer. These vegetables are grown in soil that's been fertilized with human waste, because that's the only fertilizer available, and they're contaminated with bacteria and parasites from the moment they sprout. You share your living space with your animals, which means you share their diseases, their parasites, and their waste. Your food is stored in the same area where your pig sleeps, your chickens roost, and your family relieves themselves. Cross-contamination isn't a concept you understand, it's just the reality of your daily life. When you get sick from food poisoning, which happens regularly, you have no medical care available. You suffer through the fever, the vomiting, the diarrhea, and you either recover or you die. There's no middle ground, no medical intervention, no understanding of what's happening to your body. But here's the interesting part. Peasants, despite eating the worst food available, often develop a kind of immunity through constant exposure to low levels of contamination. Your immune system is in a constant state of alert, fighting off bacteria and toxins that would fell a modern person in hours. You're sick a lot, but you're also surprisingly resilient. Now let's move up the social ladder to the merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles. These people have more money than peasants, which you might think would make their food safer. You would be wrong. The middle class has enough money to buy better food, but not enough to ensure that it's actually better. They can afford meat from healthy animals, but they can't afford to have it slaughtered fresh every day. They buy preserved meat, salted fish, and imported delicacies that have travelled long distances without refrigeration. This creates a dangerous middle ground, where the food is expensive enough to seem safe, but has actually been contaminated during processing, transport, or storage. A merchant might pay premium prices for imported cheese, not knowing that it's been aged in conditions that would horrify a modern health inspector. The middle class also has access to a wider variety of foods, which means they're exposed to a wider variety of potential toxins and contaminants. They eat exotic spices that might be adulterated with toxic substances, drink wines that have been stored in lead-glazed containers, and consume delicacies that are prepared using methods they don't understand. They're also more likely to eat at taverns and inns, where food is prepared by strangers using ingredients of unknown origin. The cook at the local tavern might be using meat that's been sitting in the kitchen for days, vegetables that were grown in contaminated soil, and water that comes from the same stream where the town dumps its waste. At the top of the social hierarchy, we find the nobles and royalty, who face the most ironic food-related dangers of all. These are people who can afford the best food available, prepared by professional cooks, served on expensive dishes, and accompanied by the finest wines. And yet, they're probably more likely to die from food poisoning than anyone else. Why? Because when you're wealthy and powerful, your food becomes a weapon that your enemies can use against you. Poisoning is the assassination method of choice for medieval nobles. It's subtle, it's deniable, and it can be made to look like natural illness or accident. A rival noble, a disgruntled servant, or a foreign enemy can slip poison into your food or drink, and you'll never know until it's too late. This creates a paranoid atmosphere around noble dining. Food tasters are employed to sample every dish before it reaches the noble's mouth. These tasters are usually servants or slaves whose lives are considered expendable, and they often die in the line of duty, sometimes immediately, sometimes slowly over time as they accumulate small doses of various toxins. But even food tasters can't protect against all forms of poisoning. Some poisons have delayed effects, taking hours or days to cause symptoms. Others are tasteless and odorless, impossible to detect until the damage is done. Still others are cumulative, building up in the body over time until they reach lethal levels. The wealthy also face dangers from the very luxury of their food. Exotic ingredients imported from distant lands might be contaminated with unfamiliar bacteria or parasites. Elaborate preparation methods might introduce new opportunities for contamination. Rich sauces and complex dishes might mask the taste and smell of spoiled ingredients. The lead glazes on expensive pottery, and the lead pipes used in wealthy households create a constant source of low-level poisoning. The wealthy drink more wine than the poor, and wine stored in lead-glazed containers slowly accumulates lead compounds that cause brain damage, kidney failure, and death. The servants who prepare food for the wealthy face their own unique dangers. They're the first to handle potentially contaminated ingredients, the first to taste dishes that might be poisoned, and the first to be blamed when something goes wrong. Kitchen servants suffer from burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation at rates that would be considered industrial accidents in the modern world. They're also the most likely to eat leftover food that's been sitting at room temperature for hours, picking up bacteria and toxins as it cools. The scraps and leftovers that servants eat are often more dangerous than the fresh food served to their masters. The irony of medieval food hierarchy is that everyone is trying to kill everyone else, just using different methods. The poor are killed by scarcity and contamination. The middle class is killed by false security and hidden dangers, and the wealthy are killed by luxury and paranoia. But perhaps the most dangerous position of all is that of the cook. Medieval cooks are responsible for preparing food that won't kill their employers, using ingredients that are often contaminated, methods that are inherently dangerous, and equipment that's primitive at best. They work in hot, smoky, dangerous conditions, handling sharp knives, boiling liquids, and open flames. When someone dies from food poisoning, the cook is usually the first person blamed. If a noble dies after eating a meal, the cook might be executed, regardless of whether the death was actually caused by the food or by poison administered by someone else entirely. This creates a profession where the job requirements include not only culinary skill, but also the ability to detect poison, identify spoiled ingredients, and survive in an environment where every meal you prepare might be your last if it goes wrong. The cook must also navigate the complex social dynamics of the kitchen, where other servants might be working for rival nobles, foreign enemies, or their own personal agendas. The person who helps you prepare a meal might be the same person who slips poison into it. As you sit down to your evening meal, whatever your social class, you're participating in a complex dance of danger that involves not just the food itself, but the entire social structure that surrounds it. Your food might be trying to kill you because it's contaminated, because it's spoiled, because it's been deliberately poisoned, or simply because the person who prepared it didn't know any better. The medieval dining table is a battlefield where the weapons are invisible, the enemies are unknown, and the casualties are counted not in bodies, but in empty chairs at tomorrow's meal. And speaking of tomorrow's meal, let's talk about what happens when medieval people gather together to eat in large groups, because if individual meals are dangerous, group dining is absolutely catastrophic. Chapter 7. The Feast of Fools. If eating alone in medieval times is like playing Russian roulette with a single bullet, then attending a medieval feast is like playing Russian roulette with multiple bullets, roulette with a fully loaded gun while blindfolded and drunk, Everything that can go wrong with individual meals gets magnified exponentially when you gather dozens or hundreds of people together to eat food that's been prepared in massive quantities by overwhelmed cooks using questionable ingredients. Medieval feasts are not just meals, they're social events, political statements, and religious observances all rolled into one elaborate, dangerous spectacle. They're also mass poisoning events waiting to happen, where the combination of large-scale food preparation, extended serving times, and communal eating creates perfect conditions for foodborne illness to spread like wildfire through the assembled guests. Let's start with the preparation process, which begins days or even weeks before the actual feast. The sheer quantity of food required means that normal food safety practices, already questionable in medieval times, go completely out the window. Animals are slaughtered in massive numbers, creating more meat than can be processed safely. Vegetables are harvested in bulk and stored in conditions that would make a modern health inspector reach for the nearest bottle of antacid. The kitchen staff, normally responsible for preparing meals for a household of perhaps a dozen people, suddenly find themselves trying to cook for hundreds. They're working with unfamiliar quantities, using equipment that's not designed for large-scale preparation, and operating under time pressure that makes careful food handling impossible. The cooking fires, already dangerous under normal circumstances, become infernos when they're scaled up to feast proportions. Multiple fires burn simultaneously, filling the kitchen with smoke, heat, and the constant risk of a catastrophic fire that could burn down the entire building. Kitchen staff work in conditions that would be considered industrial hazards in the modern world, handling massive pots of boiling liquid, turning spits loaded with entire animals, and dodging sparks from fires that are barely under control. The food itself presents challenges that don't exist with smaller meals. A roasted pig that feeds 50 people takes hours to cook properly, and there's no way to ensure that the internal temperature reaches safe levels throughout the entire carcass. The outside might be perfectly cooked, while the inside remains raw, creating a breeding ground for bacteria that will multiply rapidly in the warm environment. Sauces and gravies, prepared in enormous quantities, sit at room temperature for hours while other dishes are being prepared. These warm, nutrient-rich liquids are perfect breeding grounds for bacteria, and by the time they're served, they might contain enough pathogens to kill a horse. The serving process itself is a logistical nightmare that creates multiple opportunities for contamination. Food is prepared in the kitchen, carried through corridors and courtyards by servants whose hands are anything but clean, and served on dishes that have been washed, if at all, in cold water without soap. The time between preparation and consumption can stretch for hours. The first course might be prepared in the morning for a feast that doesn't begin until evening. By the time this food reaches the guests, it's been sitting at room temperature long enough for bacteria to multiply to dangerous levels. But the real danger begins when the guests start eating. Medieval feasts are communal affairs where people share dishes, utensils, and drinking vessels. A single person with a foodborne illness can contaminate multiple dishes simply by dipping their spoon into a shared bowl. Their saliva, carrying whatever bacteria or viruses they might be harboring, spreads throughout the feast like an invisible plague. The drinking vessels present their own special hazards. Large communal cups are passed from person to person, accumulating saliva, bacteria, and whatever diseases the previous drinkers might be carrying. By the end of the evening, these cups have become biological weapons, capable of transmitting everything from the common cold to more serious diseases. The alcohol consumption at medieval feasts creates additional dangers. Guests who are drunk are less likely to notice that their food tastes or smells off. They're more likely to eat food that's obviously spoiled, more likely to drink from contaminated vessels, and less likely to practice even the minimal food safety measures that medieval people normally observe. Drunken guests also create chaos in the serving process. They knock over dishes, spill food and drink, and generally create conditions that make it impossible to maintain even the pretense of food safety. Spilled wine mixes with dropped food on tables and floors, creating a bacterial soup that contaminates everything it touches. The entertainment at medieval feasts often involves animals, which add their own layer of contamination to the proceedings. Hunting dogs wander through the dining area, licking plates and bowls. Falcons and hawks, used for demonstration purposes, defecate on tables and food. Even the rushes, scattered on the floor, meant to absorb spills and provide cushioning, become contaminated with animal waste, spilled food, and human bodily fluids. Religious feasts present their own unique dangers. These events often involve fasting followed by massive consumption, which creates perfect conditions for food poisoning. Guests who haven't eaten for days suddenly consume large quantities of rich, heavy food that their digestive systems can't handle. The combination of an empty stomach and contaminated food often proves fatal. Holiday celebrations add seasonal dangers to the mix. Christmas feasts feature preserved meats that have been stored since the full slaughter, giving bacteria months to multiply and toxins time to accumulate. Easter celebrations involve eggs that might have been stored for weeks without refrigeration, developing salmonella and other pathogens. Wedding feasts are particularly dangerous because they combine all the hazards of large-scale food preparation with the emotional stress of a major life event. The pressure to provide an impressive feast often leads to shortcuts in food safety, and the celebratory atmosphere makes guests less cautious about what they eat and drink. The aftermath of a wedding feast gone wrong can be devastating. Imagine the horror of a celebration that turns into a mass poisoning event, where the bride and groom watch their guests fall ill one by one, not knowing whether they're witnessing the effects of bad food or deliberate poisoning by enemies who want to disrupt the marriage alliance. Funeral feasts present the ultimate irony. Gatherings meant to honor the dead that end up creating more dead to honor. These events often feature food that's been prepared by grieving family members who are too distracted by their loss to pay attention to food safety. The result is often a secondary wave of deaths that compounds the original tragedy. The seasonal timing of many feasts creates additional hazards. Harvest festivals feature newly gathered crops that might be contaminated with field bacteria or parasites. Spring celebrations use the last of the winter stores, food that's been sitting in storage for months and might be moldy, rancid, or infested with insects. The social pressure to eat at feasts makes it impossible to refuse food that looks or smells questionable. Declining to eat can be seen as an insult to the host, a sign of disrespect, or even a political statement. Guests often eat food they know is dangerous, rather than risk the social consequences of refusal. The competitive nature of medieval feasts also creates pressure to serve increasingly exotic and dangerous foods. Hosts try to outdo each other with rare ingredients, complex preparations, and elaborate presentations that prioritize spectacle over safety. The more impressive the feast, the more likely it is to kill someone. As you sit at a medieval feast, surrounded by hundreds of other guests, sharing food from communal dishes and drinking from past cups, you're participating in what amounts to a massive biological experiment. Every bite you take has been contaminated by dozens of other people. Every sip you drink has passed through countless other mouths, and every dish you sample has been prepared under conditions that would be considered criminal negligence in the modern world. The laughter and conversation around you mask the sound of stomachs beginning to cramp. The music covers the groans of guests who are starting to feel the effects of contaminated food, and the festive atmosphere disguises the fact that this celebration is slowly turning into a medical emergency. By the end of the evening, some guests will be too sick to travel home. By the end of the week, some of them will be dead. The feast that was meant to celebrate life, love, or religious devotion will be remembered instead as the event that killed Uncle Harold, Cousin Margaret, and half the wedding party. But even as the bodies are being carried out, the survivors will be planning the next feast, because in medieval times, the show must go on, even if the show is literally killing the audience. And speaking of shows, let's talk about how medieval medicine attempts to deal with the aftermath of all this food-related carnage. Because if medieval food is trying to kill you, medieval medicine is trying to finish the job. Chapter 8. Medical Misunderstanding. So you've eaten the contaminated bread, drunk the polluted water, consumed the spoiled meat, and survived the feast of death. Now you're feeling the inevitable consequences: stomach cramps, fever, nausea, and a general sense that your body is staging a revolt against your questionable dietary choices. In the modern world, this would be the point where you'd reach for some antacids, drink plenty of fluids, and maybe visit a doctor if things got really bad. In medieval times, this is where things get truly interesting, because medieval medicine's approach to food poisoning is roughly equivalent to trying to put out a fire with gasoline while blindfolded and riding a unicycle. The first problem is that medieval people have no understanding of what's actually making them sick. They don't know about bacteria, viruses, parasites, or toxins. They don't understand that invisible organisms can cause disease, that contaminated food can harbour dangerous pathogens, or that proper food handling can prevent illness. Instead, they attribute illness to a fascinating variety of causes that range from the merely wrong to the spectacularly misguided. Bad air, known as miasma, is a popular explanation for disease. Medieval people believe that illness is caused by breathing foul-smelling air, which leads them to focus on eliminating odours rather than addressing the actual sources of contamination. This miasma theory leads to some interesting medical practices. Doctors recommend carrying aromatic herbs or wearing perfumed amulets to ward off disease. They burn incense and aromatic woods to purify the air. They avoid areas that smell bad, not realizing that the smell is often a symptom of contamination rather than the cause of illness. Divine punishment is another popular explanation for food-related illness. Medieval people often interpret food poisoning as God's wrath for some sin they've committed, leading them to focus on prayer and penance rather than medical treatment. They might spend their time confessing their sins and seeking absolution while their bodies are being ravaged by bacterial toxins. Astrological influences are also blamed for illness. Medieval physicians consult star charts and planetary alignments to determine the cause of disease, leading to treatments that are timed according to celestial events rather than medical necessity. A patient might be told to wait for the moon to enter the right phase before beginning treatment, giving the illness plenty of time to progress to fatal stages. The concept of humoral imbalance dominates medieval medical thinking. According to this theory, the human body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness is caused when these humours become unbalanced, and treatment involves restoring the proper balance through various means. For food poisoning, This might mean that a physician diagnoses an excess of hot humours and prescribes cooling treatments. The patient might be given cold foods, cold drinks, or treatments designed to cool the body. Alternatively, the physician might diagnose an excess of moist humours and prescribe drying treatments. The problem is that these treatments are based on theoretical concepts that have no relationship to the actual cause of the illness. A patient suffering from bacterial food poisoning might be given treatments that actually make their condition worse, all in the name of restoring humoral balance. Bloodletting is the go-to treatment for almost every medieval ailment, including food poisoning. The theory is that removing bad blood will allow the body to produce fresh, healthy blood that will restore balance and cure the disease. In practice, bloodletting weakens patients who are already struggling to fight off infection, often turning a survivable illness into a fatal one. The bloodletting process itself is dangerous and unsanitary. Physicians use the same instruments on multiple patients without sterilization, spreading diseases from one patient to another. The wounds created by bloodletting often become infected, adding new complications to the original illness. Purging is another popular treatment for food poisoning, which seems logical until you realize that medieval purging methods are designed to be as violent and traumatic as possible. Patients are given powerful laxatives and emetics that cause violent vomiting and diarrhea, supposedly to expel the poison from their bodies. The problem is that patients suffering from food poisoning are already experiencing vomiting and diarrhea, and the medical treatment makes these symptoms worse. The violent purging can lead to severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and shock, turning a manageable case of food poisoning into a medical emergency. The substances used for purging are often toxic in their own right. Mercury, antimony, and other heavy metals are commonly prescribed as purgatives, adding new poisons to a system that's already struggling to deal with bacterial toxins. Patients might survive the original food poisoning only to die from mercury poisoning administered by their physician. Herbal remedies are widely used for food poisoning, and some of them might actually be helpful if they weren't administered alongside more dangerous treatments. However, medieval knowledge of herbal medicine is inconsistent and often dangerous. Physicians might prescribe plants that are actually toxic, thinking they're administering healing herbs. The preparation and dosing of herbal remedies is also problematic. There are no standardized preparations, no quality control, and no understanding of proper dosing. A patient might receive a remedy that's too weak to be effective, or they might receive a dose that's strong enough to be toxic. Some herbal remedies are contaminated with the same pathogens that caused the original illness. Herbs are often prepared using contaminated water stored in unsanitary conditions and handled by people who don't understand the importance of cleanliness. The cure becomes another source of infection. Prayer and religious rituals are considered essential components of medical treatment. Patients are expected to confess their sins, receive last rites, and pray for divine intervention. While these practices might provide psychological comfort, they often delay or replace actual medical treatment. Some religious treatments are actively harmful. Patients might be required to fast during their illness, depriving their bodies of the nutrition needed to fight infection. They might be required to perform physical penances that exhaust their already weakened systems. The timing of medical treatment is often determined by religious considerations rather than medical necessity. Treatments might be delayed until holy days, or they might be administered according to religious calendars rather than the progression of the disease. Medieval physicians also have a disturbing tendency to blame the patient for their illness. Food poisoning might be attributed to gluttony, lack of self-control, or moral weakness. This blame the victim approach means that patients receive lectures about their character flaws instead of effective medical treatment. The social status of the patient affects the quality of medical care they receive. Wealthy patients get elaborate treatments from university-trained physicians, while poor patients are left to the care of local wise women or barber surgeons whose knowledge is limited and whose methods are often dangerous. But here's the truly tragic part. Some medieval people do figure out effective treatments for food poisoning, usually through trial and error rather than medical theory. They discover that certain herbs can settle the stomach, that clean water helps with dehydration, and that rest and simple foods aid recovery. However, this practical knowledge is often dismissed by trained physicians as folk medicine or old wives' tales. The medical establishment, with its university degrees and theoretical knowledge, considers itself superior to practical experience, leading to situations where effective treatments are abandoned in favor of dangerous theoretical approaches. As you lie in your medieval sickbed, suffering from food poisoning and receiving medical treatment that's making you worse, you begin to understand why so many people die from illnesses that should be survivable. It's not just the food that's trying to kill you, it's the entire medical system that's supposed to save you. Your physician bleeds you to restore humoral balance, purges you to expel poison, and prescribes herbal remedies that might be toxic. He consults star charts to determine the best time for treatment and recommends prayer and fasting to address the spiritual causes of your illness. Meanwhile, your body is fighting a desperate battle against bacterial toxins, dehydration, and the effects of the medical treatments themselves. Your immune system, already weakened by poor nutrition and chronic exposure to pathogens, is struggling to cope with the additional stress of medieval medicine. But somehow, against all odds, some people do survive. They recover from food poisoning despite their medical treatment, not because of it. They develop immunity through constant exposure to low levels of contamination. They learn to recognize the signs of dangerous food and avoid the worst hazards. These survivors represent a kind of natural selection in action, where only the strongest, luckiest, or most adaptable individuals make it through the gauntlet of medieval dining. They're the ones who pass on their genes, their knowledge, and their hard-won wisdom about how to survive in a world where every meal is a potential death sentence. And that brings us to our final topic: how anyone managed to survive medieval dining at all, and what we can learn from their remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming culinary danger. Chapter 9. Survival against the odds. After everything we've discussed tonight, you might be wondering how anyone survived medieval dining at all. How did entire civilizations persist when every meal was a potential death sentence, every drink was contaminated, and every feast was a mass poisoning event waiting to happen? The answer is both simple and remarkable. Human beings are incredibly adaptable, and medieval people developed survival strategies that allowed them to navigate this culinary minefield with a success rate that, while not impressive by modern standards, was sufficient to keep the species going. First and foremost, medieval people developed what we might call educated paranoia about their food. They learned to recognize the signs of spoilage, contamination, and danger through hard-won experience. A medieval peasant could tell by smell whether bread was safe to eat, could identify meat that was too far gone even for medieval standards, and could spot water that was more dangerous than usual. This knowledge was passed down through generations, creating an oral tradition of food safety that was based on practical experience rather than scientific understanding. Children learned from their parents which foods to avoid, which preparation methods were safest, and which symptoms indicated serious food poisoning rather than the routine digestive distress that everyone experienced. Medieval people also developed remarkable tolerance for what we would consider unacceptable food. Their digestive systems, constantly exposed to low levels of contamination, built up resistance to many common pathogens. Their immune systems were in a constant state of alert, fighting off bacteria and toxins that would hospitalize a modern person. This isn't to say that medieval people were healthier than modern people, quite the opposite. They suffered from chronic digestive problems, frequent illness, and shortened lifespans. But they were adapted to their environment in ways that allowed them to function despite conditions that would be considered uninhabitable today. The medieval diet, for all its dangers, also had some protective elements. The constant consumption of alcohol, while creating its own health problems, did provide some protection against waterborne pathogens. The heavy use of salt, while contributing to high blood pressure and other issues, did help preserve food and inhibit bacterial growth. Certain spices that were popular in medieval cooking actually have antimicrobial properties. Garlic, onions, and various herbs contain compounds that can kill or inhibit bacteria. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind these effects, but they observed that certain seasonings seemed to make food safer, and they incorporated this knowledge into their cooking practices. The timing of medieval meals also provided some protection. People often ate their main meal in the middle of the day, when food had been freshly prepared and hadn't had time to accumulate dangerous levels of bacteria. Evening meals were often lighter, consisting of foods that were less likely to cause serious illness if they were slightly spoiled. Seasonal eating patterns, while driven by necessity rather than choice, also provided some protection. People ate fresh foods when they were available and preserved foods when they had to. This meant that they weren't constantly exposed to the same types of contamination, giving their immune systems a chance to recover between different types of food-related challenges. The social structure of medieval society, for all its inequalities, also provided some protection against food-related disasters. The feudal system meant that food production and distribution were organized at the community level with local knowledge and oversight that could identify and address problems before they became widespread. Medieval people also developed sophisticated preservation techniques that, while not perfect, were effective enough to prevent mass starvation. They learned to smoke meat properly, to salt fish effectively, and to store grain in ways that minimized spoilage. These techniques were refined over generations, with each community developing methods that worked best for their local conditions. The religious calendar provided structure to medieval eating patterns that offered some protection against food-related illness. Fasting periods gave digestive systems a chance to recover from constant assault, while feast days were carefully timed to coincide with the availability of fresh food. Medieval people also developed a remarkable ability to distinguish between different types of illness and to respond appropriately. They might not have understood the scientific causes of food poisoning, but they could recognize its symptoms and knew which folk remedies were most likely to help. The community-based nature of medieval society meant that knowledge about food safety was shared widely. When someone discovered that a particular batch of grain was contaminated, or that meat from a certain animal was making people sick, this information spread quickly through the community, helping others avoid the same dangers. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people had realistic expectations about food and health. They didn't expect to live long, healthy lives free from illness. They accepted that food-related sickness was a normal part of life, and they developed coping strategies that allowed them to function despite chronic health problems. This acceptance wasn't resignation, it was adaptation. Medieval people learned to work around their limitations, to plan for illness, and to support each other through the inevitable periods of sickness that everyone experienced. The survivors of medieval dining were those who combined caution with resilience, knowledge with adaptability, and community support with individual toughness. They were people who could eat questionable food when they had to, recognize truly dangerous food when they saw it, and recover from food poisoning when it inevitably occurred. These survival strategies weren't perfect, and they came at a tremendous cost in terms of human suffering and shortened lifespans. But they were sufficient to allow medieval civilization to persist and eventually develop the knowledge and technology that would make food safer for future generations. Chapter 10. The Modern Miracle. As we reach the end of our journey through the culinary dangers of medieval times, take a moment to look around your modern kitchen. That humming refrigerator in the corner, maintaining a constant temperature that would have seemed like magic to a medieval person. The clean water flowing from your tap, treated and tested to standards that didn't exist until the 20th century. The sealed packages of food with their expiration dates, nutritional information, and government inspection stamps. Every single element of modern food safety represents centuries of accumulated knowledge, hard-won through the suffering and death of countless people who ate contaminated food, drank polluted water, and died from illnesses that we now prevent with simple precautions. The pasteurization process that makes your milk safe was developed because people kept dying from milk-borne diseases. The refrigeration that preserves your food exists because people kept dying from spoiled meat. The water treatment that makes your tap water potable was implemented because people kept dying from waterborne illnesses. Behind every food safety regulation is a story of people who died because that regulation didn't exist yet. Behind every inspection stamp is a history of contaminated food that killed people before we learned to prevent contamination. Behind every expiration date is a legacy of people who ate spoiled food because they had no way to know it was dangerous. The invisible army of food safety workers who make your meals possible includes farmers who follow safety protocols, processors who maintain sanitary conditions, inspectors who test for contamination, truckers who maintain cold chains, and store employees who rotate stock and monitor temperatures. None of these people existed in medieval times, and their absence meant that every meal was a gamble with death. The scientific knowledge that underlies modern food safety was built on the graves of people who died from food-related illnesses. Germ theory, the understanding that invisible organisms can cause disease, wasn't accepted until the late 19th century. Before that, people died from contaminated food without understanding why. The technology that makes modern food safe, from refrigeration to pasteurization to chemical preservatives, was developed in response to the massive death toll from food-related illnesses. Every innovation represents a solution to a problem that was killing people on a massive scale. Even the simple act of washing your hands before eating, something so basic that we teach it to children, represents knowledge that was hard-won through centuries of observation and experimentation. Medieval people didn't understand the connection between dirty hands and food-related illness, so they kept getting sick from contamination that could have been prevented with soap and water. The global food distribution system that brings you fresh produce from around the world, meat from distant farms, and processed foods from industrial facilities operates under safety standards that would have been incomprehensible to medieval people. The idea that food could travel thousands of miles and still be safe to eat would have seemed like fantasy to someone whose local grain supply was contaminated with mouse droppings. The regulatory agencies that oversee food safety, from the FDA to local health departments, exist because people kept dying from contaminated food until governments were forced to intervene. The inspections, the testing, the recalls, the prosecutions of companies that violate safety standards, all of this exists because the alternative is a return to medieval levels of food-related death and suffering. The medical knowledge that allows us to treat food poisoning effectively, from understanding the importance of hydration to knowing which antibiotics work against which bacteria, was developed through centuries of watching people die from illnesses that we now consider minor inconveniences. Even the simple expectation that food should be safe to eat represents a fundamental shift in human consciousness. Medieval people expected their food to be dangerous and developed strategies for surviving that danger. Modern people expect their food to be safe and are shocked when it isn't. This expectation of safety isn't naive. It's the result of centuries of work by countless people who dedicated their lives to making food safer. It's a testament to human ingenuity, persistence, and the refusal to accept that food-related death is inevitable. As you sit down to your next meal, remember that you're participating in a miracle that would have been unimaginable to a medieval person. The food on your plate has been grown, processed, transported, and prepared under conditions that prioritize your safety above all else. The water in your glass has been treated to remove pathogens that killed millions of people throughout history. You can eat without fear, drink without paranoia, and expect to wake up tomorrow morning not because you're lucky, but because you live in a time and place where food safety is taken seriously. You're protected by knowledge that was paid for with the lives of people who ate dangerous food because they had no choice. The medieval dining experience that we've explored tonight isn't just history. It's a reminder of how far we've come and how much we have to be grateful for. Every safe meal you eat is a victory over the forces that once made eating a daily dance with death. So the next time you complain that your food is cold, or that the restaurant is slow, or that the grocery store is out of your favorite brand, remember the medieval peasant who would have considered any of these problems to be unimaginable luxury. Remember the medieval noble who employed food tasters because every meal might be poisoned. Remember the medieval cook who risked execution every time they prepared a meal. Remember that for most of human history, every meal could genuinely be your last, not because of war or violence or natural disaster, but simply because the food itself was trying to kill you. And remember that you live in the first era in human history where this is no longer true, where food is not just sustenance, but a source of pleasure, comfort, and social connection rather than fear. That's the real miracle of modern food safety. Not just that we've made food safer, but that we've made it possible to enjoy eating without the constant fear that characterized medieval dining. We've turned one of humanity's most basic needs from a source of terror into a source of joy, and that perhaps is the greatest victory of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dangerous world of medieval dining. I hope it's given you a new appreciation for the simple act of eating safely, and perhaps a bit more patience the next time your dinner is a few minutes late. If you enjoyed this little taste of history's deadlier dinners, give the like button a stab and subscribe for more. Until next time, eat safely, sleep soundly, and may your leftovers never plot against you.